Dark clouds roll across a blood-red sky. A silence hangs heavy over the land, broken only by the distant cries of crows circling above a forest of wooden stakes. Each stake is crowned with the lifeless body of a victim, stretched, twisted, and left as a warning. Their hollow eyes stare into eternity, silent witnesses to a reign that redefined cruelty. This is not just war. This is not just vengeance. This is a spectacle of terror, carefully designed to shatter hope, crush resistance, and etch fear into the bones of all who dared oppose him. Vlad the Impaler, the man whose very name would echo through centuries as a nightmare, built his legacy, not only on victory, but on horror itself. His punishments went far beyond execution. They were performances of pain, orchestrated to strip away humanity and turn enemies into symbols of absolute submission. But behind the smoke of battle and the rivers of blood lies something darker. A ruler who believed cruelty was the strongest currency of power. He transformed his land into a theatre of suffering, where the stage was the battlefield, and the actors, unwilling men, women, and even children, were condemned to roles they never chose. And tonight, you will descend into that world, a world where justice was twisted into vengeance, where cruelty was celebrated as strength, and where the line between man and monster vanished beneath the shadow of sharpened stakes. Stay with me, because once you step into Vlad's domain, you will never see the meaning of punishment the same way again. The land of Wallachia lay cradled between mountains and rivers, a place where rolling hills gave way to dense forests, so thick they seemed endless. To outsiders, it was a land of beauty. Valleys bathed in golden sunlight, villages clustered around stone churches, and fields where peasants bent their backs to the soil, praying that harvest would be kind. But beneath this veneer of calm, the land carried scars invisible to the eye. Generations of invaders had trampled across its soil. Ottoman armies marching from the east, Hungarian lords pressing from the west, and nomadic raiders sweeping down from the north. Every border was fragile, every promise of peace temporary. The people who lived here had learned that life was a cycle of submission and survival. One season might bring prosperity, the next, ruin. And always, in the shadows, lingered the bitter truth. To be born in this place was to inherit a life of fear. In the villages, men worked the earth with hands cracked from toil, their skin weathered by both the sun and the lash. Women carried water from rivers, their eyes lowered, avoiding the gaze of soldiers who passed through. Children played in dusty streets, yet even their laughter carried a nervous edge, for they too sensed the weight of the world they had inherited. They grew up quickly in Wallachia, learning to bow their heads before power, whether that power wore a crown, a cross, or a turban. The social order was as rigid as the mountains that loomed over the land. At the top sat the boyars, the noble families whose estates stretched across fertile plains. They lived behind fortified walls, their wealth secured not by fairness, but by the endless labor of peasants bound to their lands. Below them, the villagers carried lives that were little more than chains in disguise. Their worth was measured in taxes paid, harvests delivered, and bodies sacrificed in endless wars not of their choosing. But what cut deepest was not just the hierarchy of wealth and power, it was the hierarchy of blood. Those who spoke the language of outsiders, who bore foreign customs, or whose skin marked them as different, were often treated as lesser, expendable, or dangerous. Whispers spread that some blood was purer than others, that loyalty could only be measured by heritage, and that to be other in Wallachia was to be a perpetual target. Religion, too, played its part in division. The Orthodox Church stood as both a beacon and a weapon, offering salvation to the faithful, but condemning those who worshipped differently. In a land trapped between empires, Christian Hungary on one side, Muslim Ottomans on the other, faith was more than belief. It was identity, weapon, and excuse for cruelty. A man's soul could be damned as easily as his body destroyed, depending on which banner flew over his village that season. And yet, despite this fragile balance of power, life went on. Farmers sowed their seeds. Mothers sang lullabies. Merchants carried goods across dangerous roads, praying to return home. Alive. To live in Wallachia was to exist in the eye of a storm, knowing that beyond the fragile calm, winds of violence gathered. The forests themselves seemed to hold the memory of centuries of blood. Travelers told of ancient battles fought beneath their branches, of unmarked graves hidden under moss, of cries that echoed at night when the wind shifted just so. For the people of the land, these were not just stories, they were warnings. The earth itself whispered that suffering was never far away. In this land of shadows and scars, fear was as common as bread. Children grew up hearing tales of conquerors who enslaved entire villages, of nobles who tortured their own subjects, of soldiers who spared neither women nor the old. Each generation passed down not only their land, but their trauma, etched into memory like carvings in stone. And yet even in such darkness there was hope. Fragile, flickering, but stubborn. Hope that the harvest would be enough to survive the winter. Hope that wars might pass them by. Hope that one ruler, someday, would bring stability instead of suffering. It was this fragile hope that gave meaning to their labor, that kept them from collapsing under the weight of endless oppression. But hope is a dangerous thing, because in lands where hope survives, so too does disappointment, and disappointment often becomes rage. The world of Wallachia stood on the brink. The balance between survival and ruin was thin as a thread. It only needed a hand, ruthless, unyielding, and merciless, to snap that thread and plunge the land into terror unlike anything its people had ever known. That hand was already rising, and its name was Vlad. From the moment of his birth, Vlad's life was entwined with violence. He entered the world not in peace, but in an era of shifting, thrones and endless betrayals. His father, Vlad II, carried the name Dracul, meaning the dragon, sworn as a knight to a secretive order whose emblem was fire and cross. Yet in the eyes of his enemies, that same name carried darker meaning, the devil. For young Vlad, even a family name was both a weapon and a curse. The boy did not grow in safety. From childhood, he was surrounded by treachery and war. Nobles plotted against his father. Armies clashed at the edges of his homeland. And when alliances failed, sons became pawns. Vlad and his younger brother were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court, bargaining chips in a cruel game between empires. Imagine being a child, torn from the familiarity of home, thrust into the glittering yet suffocating halls of a foreign power. There, among marble walls and golden mosaics, Vlad learned what it meant to live at the mercy of men who smiled with their lips but held knives behind their backs. He studied language, strategy, and the art of rule. But he also learned humiliation, suspicion, and the sting of being treated as expendable. Every day was a test, loyalty questioned, honor denied. The Ottomans demanded obedience, and any sign of rebellion was punished with lash, with chain, with fear. It was here that the seed of hatred was planted deep within Vlad's soul. Hatred not only for his captors, but for weakness itself. He swore he would never be at the mercy of another man again. When at last he returned to Wallachia, he returned, not as a boy, but as something forged in fire. The land he came home to was fractured, bleeding from endless wars between nobles who placed ambition above loyalty. Villages were torn apart by raids, peasants crushed under impossible taxes, and rulers changed like the seasons, each promising order, each delivering chaos. Vlad saw what others refused to admit, that mercy was a mask easily torn away, that treaties were fragile lies, and that fear was the only weapon strong enough to bend men to obedience. He had watched his father betrayed by boyars who smiled as allies and struck as assassins. He had seen his people enslaved by foreign armies, while their so-called leaders turned blind eyes. And so he made a vow, silent and unyielding. He would rule through terror, because terror could not be betrayed. As he seized power, whispers followed him. Whispers of the boy who had returned harder than stone, colder than steel. Nobles who thought him young and pliable soon discovered the truth. That Vlad's vengeance was precise, deliberate, and merciless. He did not forget slights. He did not forgive treachery. To betray him was not simply to risk death, but to invite a fate that lingered long after life had fled the body. And beneath it all ran another current, the deep divisions of blood, belief, and origin. Vlad saw his land caught between empires, the Christian kingdoms of the West and the Muslim Ottomans of the East, and in that divide, suspicion festered. Those who were different in tongue, in faith, in heritage, became convenient scapegoats. Where others saw neighbors, Vlad saw threats. To him, survival meant purging weakness, rooting out betrayal before it could bloom, and showing that no mercy would be offered to those deemed other. This was not simply the rise of a ruler, it was the rise of a philosophy, one born from captivity, sharpened by betrayal, and baptized in vengeance. Vlad would not build his reign on love or loyalty. He would build it on fear, layer by layer, until it towered above all other powers, like the sharpened stakes that would soon bear the weight of thousands of his enemies. The boy, who had once been powerless, had returned as a man who would redefine cruelty. And the land, weary from chaos, looked upon him with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Perhaps he would bring order. Perhaps he would end the endless cycle of raids and betrayals. But no one yet understood the price that would be paid. In the silence before his reign of terror began, the air itself seemed to tremble. For Wallachia had gained not just a ruler, but a storm. A storm that would sweep across fields and forests, across noble courts and peasant huts, leaving behind only whispers of the man who would one day be known as Vlad the Impaler. The throne of Wallachia was never a seat of comfort. It was a seat of daggers. Every noble who bent the knee did so with suspicion. Every promise of loyalty concealed a blade in the shadows. Vlad knew this better than anyone, for he had watched his own father betrayed by boyars whose oaths had turned to dust the moment it suited their ambition. And so, when he claimed power, he did not waste time with illusions of trust. His first acts as ruler were not proclamations of peace, but demonstrations of vengeance. Nobles who had conspired against his family were summoned under the guise of celebration. The great halls filled with feasting and false smiles, but as the night deepened, the doors were barred and the revelry turned to horror. Some nobles were executed on the spot. Others were marched into the night, their fates sealed in silence. Those who survived carried trembling memories back to their estates, memories that would spread like wildfire. The new ruler was not a man to be trifled with. Fear, once only a whisper, now became law. Vlad's punishments were not merely executions, they were performances. When thieves were caught, their fate was not prison, but the stake. When soldiers deserted, their bodies became warnings on the roadside. Each crime, no matter how small, was answered with brutality so extreme that it branded itself into the minds of all who witnessed it. The roads of Wallachia began to change. Where once travelers feared bandits, they now feared the sight of sharpened wood rising against the horizon. But cruelty alone does not spread without witnesses. Vlad understood this well. He ensured that his punishments were not hidden away in dungeons or behind castle walls. They were displayed in fields, at crossroads, at the very gates of towns, where every passerby would see what happened to those who defied him. The land itself became a theatre, its stage littered with bodies, its audience trembling peasants and terrified nobles. And within this spreading shadow, racial and cultural divisions deepened. Those who spoke with foreign accents, who bore ties to the Ottoman Turks, or who were seen as outsiders within Wallachia, often became the first victims of suspicion. Their loyalty questioned, their lives cheapened. They found themselves at the mercy of a ruler who equated difference with danger. The message was clear. To be part of the other was to be disposable. The people, peasants who had long endured suffering, found themselves caught in a web of contradictions. Some whispered that Vlad was a savior, for under his reign, roads became safer, raids diminished, and merchants could travel with less fear of bandits. Yet this safety came at an unbearable price. The ever-present threat that even the smallest misstep, the slightest appearance of disloyalty, could lead to unimaginable torment. For the common folk, survival meant silence. It meant lowering their eyes, obeying without question, and watching as neighbors vanished into the night, never to return. Each morning brought new rumors of entire families impaled for suspected treachery, of villages punished for failing to deliver enough tribute, of nobles roasted alive for plotting betrayal. The shadow spread not only through punishment but through memory. Children grew up not with fairy tales, but with nightmares spoken as warnings. Parents taught obedience with trembling voices, pointing to the fields where bodies swayed in the wind. Even those who had not suffered directly carried the weight of terror in their hearts, for fear was contagious, passing from word to word, glance to glance. And yet, in the silence of this terror, an illusion of order began to take shape. Merchants spoke of a land where justice was swift. Villages whispered that crime had diminished. Nobles trembled but complied, their rebellions crushed before they could begin. From the outside, it seemed as though Wallachia had found stability at last. But those who lived beneath Vlad's gaze knew the truth. This was not stability, but paralysis. A society held together not by trust or unity, but by dread. The forests, once places of whispered legends, now bore new stories. Travelers told of vast fields where thousands of stakes rose like a forest of death, each crowned with a rotting body. They told of the smell that carried for miles, of the silence of birds who would not sing near such places. These were not simply executions, they were landscapes of horror, carved into the memory of all who saw them. And with each act, the line between justice and cruelty blurred further. What had begun as punishment for betrayal became a tool for domination. What was once a spectacle of vengeance became the very foundation of rule. Vlad was no longer simply a prince. He was becoming something else, an embodiment of terror itself, a figure who would be remembered not for his victories, but for the shadows he cast across an entire land. The seeds of fear had been sown. Now they would take root, growing into a forest of horror that would define his reign. And as the people whispered prayers in the dark, one truth became inescapable. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived. The first whispers of Vlad's cruelty were enough to freeze men in their tracks. But whispers alone were not enough for him. He wanted fear, not as rumor, but as reality, carved into the very earth of Wallachia. And so, the punishments that once struck at single traitors began to stretch their reach, growing into something vast, deliberate, and unforgettable. One morning, travelers approaching the capital found the air thick with an unfamiliar stench. As they neared the gates, the source revealed itself. A field of sharpened stakes, hundreds of them, planted in precise rows like a grotesque forest. Upon each one, a body was impaled, their faces twisted in eternal agony, their lifeless eyes staring at nothing. These were not faceless criminals. They were men, women, even children, taken from villages accused of rebellion, accused of withholding tribute, accused of sympathy for the enemy. Their crime was disobedience, and their punishment was transformation into a warning. The display was deliberate. The stakes stood where no traveler could avoid them, where merchants, soldiers, and peasants alike were forced to witness what defiance meant. The silence of the field was broken only by the caws of crows that feasted on flesh and the sickly buzz of flies that swarmed in clouds. The people passing by would never forget. That was the point. Vlad had discovered the power of spectacle. To him, fear was not useful unless it was visible. Each act of cruelty became a performance, staged in open spaces where the greatest number of eyes could see. His executions were not moments of justice, but ceremonies of terror, calculated to strip away not only the lives of the condemned, but the hope of those who watched. No one was beyond reach. A village that failed to meet tax. Demands could see its entire population march to the stakes. Merchants who cheated in trade were flayed and displayed in market squares. Soldiers who deserted were impaled along the roads, their bodies swaying as eternal warnings to comrades who might dream of escape. Even noble families, long accustomed to playing games of betrayal, learned quickly that deceit against Vlad ended, not with exile, but with annihilation. And the punishments grew in scale. What began with a handful of victims swelled into hundreds, then thousands. The land itself began to change, its valleys dotted with fields of corpses, its crossroads marked by death. To travel through Wallachia was to travel through a theatre of horror, each mile bringing a new act in a performance that seemed endless. Yet what made it unbearable was not only the sight, but the knowledge that these acts were intentional, orchestrated with precision. Vlad ensured that his cruelty was remembered in detail. Survivors were left alive not out of mercy, but so they could carry stories back to their villages, so they could describe the sound of screams, the smell of decay, the way the sky itself seemed darker above the forests of stakes. He understood that fear could travel faster than any army, faster than any messenger, faster than truth itself, and fear began to reshape the people. In villages, neighbors turned against each other, desperate to prove loyalty, to avoid suspicion. A careless word could be reported, a doubtful glance misinterpreted, trust dissolved. Families shrank into silence, teaching their children not songs of joy, but lessons in obedience. Do not speak, do not question, do not think you are safe. But the cruelest twist was that Vlad's reign of terror brought results. Banditry diminished, roads became safer. Merchants who once feared raids now spoke of traveling through Wallachia without attack, so long as they followed the rules. Even foreign emissaries admitted in quiet that Vlad's methods worked. Where law had failed, where mercy had been betrayed, fear succeeded, and so the paradox of Wallachia deepened. The people hated the sight of death, yet clung to the safety it brought them. They prayed for deliverance from cruelty, yet feared that without it, chaos would return. They despised their ruler, yet whispered his name with awe, as though he were something more than human, a force of nature, a storm in the shape of a man. In the theatre of fear, everyone was both audience and actor. The peasants, forced to watch, lived their lives in constant dread. The nobles, stripped of arrogance, performed loyalty with trembling hands. Even foreign powers, observing from afar, began to take note. Here was a man who ruled not with armies alone, but with terror so absolute that it crushed rebellion before it could breathe. The stage was set. The performances grew larger, darker, more ambitious. And the land itself, its fields, its forests, its very roads, became props in a nightmare that never ended. Vlad had built his theatre, and the world was watching. Fear had already settled over Wallachia like a heavy fog. But now it began to sharpen into something even more dangerous. Suspicion. It was no longer enough to obey Vlad's commands, no longer enough to avoid open defiance. To be safe under his rule, one had to prove loyalty constantly, endlessly, and above all, one had to belong. And belonging was not granted to everyone. Those who spoke with accents that betrayed foreign birth, who bore names tied to Ottoman soil, or who carried skin a shade darker than their neighbors found themselves watched with sharper eyes. Men whose families had traded with Turks, women who had married into foreign bloodlines, even children raised in different customs, all became targets of quiet hostility. Vlad saw these divisions and used them as fuel. To him, the other was not simply different, it was dangerous. The Ottomans had once held him hostage, had sought to bend him into a tool for their empire. Now, anyone who bore their language, their faith, their culture, became suspect in his eyes. And suspicion under Vlad was as deadly as guilt. Entire communities were rounded up under the accusation of treachery. Some were accused of passing secrets to the enemy, others of harboring sympathies, still others of simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their homes were stripped bare, their families torn apart, and their bodies added to the growing forest of stakes. The injustice was staggering. Innocence offered no shield. A man who had lived peacefully his entire life, who had never raised a hand in rebellion, could be condemned because of his lineage. A child, too young to understand politics or betrayal, could meet the same fate simply because her family spoke a foreign tongue. Vlad's cruelty, once aimed at traitors and criminals, now consumed anyone who could be labeled outsider. The people of Wallachia watched in silence. Some whispered that it was necessary, that rooting out the other was the only way to protect the land from betrayal. Others trembled in secret, knowing that such logic had no end, that once it began, suspicion would eventually devour everyone. But no one dared to speak openly. To question was to invite the same fate. Fear warped the bonds of community. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, pointing fingers to divert suspicion from themselves. Families turned inward, abandoning friendships that stretched across cultural lines. Markets grew quieter as foreign merchants avoided Wallachia, unwilling to risk becoming the next victims of paranoia. And yet, the stage of cruelty grew more elaborate. Vlad did not hide these purges. He displayed them with pride. Outsiders accused of treachery were impaled not in secret, but in rows visible to all who passed. In his mind, these spectacles proved his strength, sending a message to both his people and his enemies. Wallachia was cleansed of weakness, cleansed of betrayal, cleansed of difference. But the truth was darker. What he called cleansing was nothing more than annihilation. The cruelty was not only physical but spiritual. The Orthodox Church, bound to Vlad's rule, declared the condemned as heretics, unworthy of salvation. Priests stood beside the stakes, blessing the soil as though the slaughter was holy. In this way, injustice was cloaked in righteousness, and fear disguised as faith. Beyond Wallachia's borders, tales spread like wildfire. Ambassadors described fields where thousands of bodies swayed in the wind, most of them villagers whose only crime was belonging to the wrong culture. Some foreign rulers recoiled in horror, while others admired Vlad's purity of rule, whispering that perhaps terror was the strongest glue for fragile kingdoms. Inside the land, the cost was unbearable. Mothers carried their children past, rows of corpses, telling them to never speak to strangers, never reveal their heritage, never trust a soul. Men worked their fields in silence, knowing that even a hint of association with the wrong bloodline could doom their families. Life became a performance of conformity. Every action measured, every word weighed, every glance controlled. The theatre of fear had grown darker. Its cast expanded. It was no longer only rebels and criminals who filled the stage, but entire groups erased for being different. The condemned were not just punished, they were erased from memory. Their communities shattered, their stories silenced, and so the land itself grew quieter. Villages once alive with markets and music now carried only the sound of the wind passing over empty homes. Forests once alive with laughter now held only the creak of wood as bodies shifted on their stakes. In Vlad's Wallachia, difference had become a death sentence, and the world of shadows that he had built grew larger still. The terror no longer felt like isolated acts of cruelty. It had become the very air of Wallachia, invisible, suffocating, inescapable. By now, the people understood. Vlad the Impaler's rule was not built on loyalty, nor on justice, nor on faith. It was built on fear, and fear alone. Every village bore scars of his obsession. At first, the executions had seemed like warnings, the punishments of a harsh but vigilant ruler. But as months turned into years, the cruelty no longer followed any pattern that people could understand. Nobles who once dined at Vlad's table vanished overnight. Peasants who had toiled faithfully for decades were impaled for imagined slights. Even loyal soldiers sometimes found themselves displayed on stakes, their armor still clinging to their bodies as if mocking their devotion. Trust had evaporated. Husbands feared their wives' words, fathers doubted their sons, neighbors avoided each other's eyes. To speak too loudly, to ask too many questions, even to hesitate when proclaiming loyalty, All could be seen as treason. The kingdom had become a theatre in which every subject was forced to play the same role: obedient, silent, unquestioning. The countryside transformed into a graveyard. Travellers reported fields of impalement so vast they seemed endless. Some spoke of 10,000 corpses swaying on sharpened stakes, forming ghastly forests that stretched beyond the horizon. Wolves prowled among the dead, feasting at night. Birds circled endlessly above. To those who passed, it was as if life itself had abandoned the land, leaving only shadows and silence. And yet, Vlad called this order. In his mind, terror was a tool of purification, a cleansing fire that would burn away weakness, disloyalty, and difference. He declared himself the protector of Wallachia, but his protection was a prison of blood. No one, not noble nor peasant, ally nor foreigner, could ever feel safe. His reign promised only one truth: survival belonged to those who disappeared into obedience. But even beyond Wallachia's borders, his reputation was no longer that of a ruler. It was that of a monster. Ambassadors carried back tales that grew darker with each retelling. In Hungary, people whispered of a man who feasted beneath forests of the impaled. In the Ottoman Empire, he became a nightmare to frighten children. In Germany, pamphlets painted him as a demon wearing a crown. His name became synonymous with horror itself. And yet, there were those who admired him. To some rulers, his brutality was proof of strength. In an age where kingdoms crumbled under betrayal and invasion, Vlad's Wallachia stood unbroken. His reign, though stained with blood, was a reign of order. Where others saw barbarity, they saw survival. But for those who lived within his reach, survival had lost all meaning. What was life if lived only in fear? If every sunrise might reveal a loved one impaled among the dead? Wallachia had become a kingdom of shadows, a place where the earth itself seemed poisoned, where human cruelty had stripped the land of its soul. And yet, the worst was still to come. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant moan of the wind. Torches burned along the palace walls, their flames bending in the cool air, casting shifting shadows across stone battlements. But beyond the light, just outside the gates, stretched a horror that no shadow could hide. The field of the impaled. Rows upon rows of bodies swayed in the night, their pale forms illuminated in the torchlight, eyes wide and unseeing, mouths frozen in silent screams. The stench of blood and decay thickened the air, carried by every breeze that passed through the sharpened stakes. It was a sight designed not merely to punish, but to remind all who looked upon it that in Wallachia, life and death were granted only at Vlad's command. It was here, in the heart of this nightmare, that Vlad chose to celebrate. Inside the great hall, tables were set with golden chalices, silver platters, and roasted meats that glistened under candlelight. Minstrels plucked strings, their trembling hands forcing out melodies that sounded more like funeral dirges than songs of joy. Nobles, envoys, and loyal retainers sat stiffly in their seats, trying not to glance at the windows where, if they dared, they could see the outlines of the impaled against the night sky. Vlad himself presided at the head of the table. His presence was commanding, his eyes burning with the cold fire of control. Every movement of his hand, every lift of his goblet, carried with it the weight of unspoken threat. To sit at his table was to sit in the presence of a storm, beautiful in its grandeur, deadly in its power. But the true theatre of the night was not within the hall. It was beyond its walls. As the feast began, Vlad ordered the windows thrown open. A chill swept in, carrying with it the fetid stench of rotting flesh. Guests shifted uncomfortably, their faces blanching, but none dared protest. Vlad smiled thinly, raising his goblet. He invited his guests to drink, to feast, to enjoy the bounty of the land, while thousands of bodies rotted just beyond their reach. The music played louder, struggling to cover the sounds that drifted in from outside. The creak of wood, the flutter of wings as crows tore at flesh. the faint whisper of the dying who had not yet succumbed to their wounds. The hall was filled with the richness of roasted boar, spiced wine, and honeyed bread, yet the air itself was thick with decay. Every bite, every sip became a test of loyalty. To eat was to accept the spectacle. To hesitate was to risk being accused of weakness. Guests forced down mouthfuls, their eyes fixed on their plates, their minds screaming as their ears picked up the muffled sobs of those still clinging to life outside. And Vlad watched them all. He measured their every movement, every flicker of hesitation. To him this was more than a feast. It was a performance, a ritual of power. The food was not nourishment, it was proof. Proof that fear ruled more absolutely than any sword. Proof that those who lived in his shadow would obey, even as death pressed against the walls of their celebration. At the height of the feast, Vlad rose from his seat. He lifted his goblet high, wine spilling like blood across the table. With a voice that cut through the music, he toasted not to victory, not to God, not even to his guests, but to fear itself, to the power it gave him, to the silence it demanded, to the order it enforced. The hall echoed with forced cheers, trembling voices that broke under the strain of terror. The guests drank, their throats tightening as they swallowed not just wine, but submission. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the cries of the dying into the hall like a chorus of ghosts. The sound mingled with the laughter Vlad forced upon his guests, creating a symphony of horror that would linger in their memories long after the night ended. When the feast was finally over, the guests departed in silence, their faces pale, their steps unsteady. Some vomited as soon as they left the hall, unable to stomach the weight of what they had been forced to endure. Others swore to themselves that they would never speak of what they had seen, for to speak was to risk death. But they all carried the same thought, etched into their minds as deeply as the stakes were driven into the earth outside. In Wallachia, survival was not measured by loyalty, nor by faith, nor by strength. It was measured only by fear. And Vlad the Impaler had proven, beyond all doubt, that he was its master. The banquet had been a private horror, confined within stone walls. But what Vlad prepared next was no intimate display. It was a vision meant, for the world, a nightmare so vast that it would echo through history. It began with prisoners, thousands of them, captured soldiers, foreign merchants, wandering travelers, and villagers accused of disloyalty. To Vlad, their identities mattered little. Their fates had already been decided. The orders spread quickly through the land. Sharpen the stakes. Raise them high. Prepare the fields. Carpenters and peasants worked under armed guard, their hands blistered as they stripped forests bare. Each trunk was carved into a weapon of display, its point honed to pierce flesh and bone. By the time the work was done, the countryside itself seemed transformed into an arsenal of death. And then the executions began. One by one, they were dragged forward. Some screamed, others wept. A few stared blankly into the sky as if already beyond fear. The process was slow, methodical, ritualistic. Stakes were driven into the ground with brutal precision. Bodies lifted, impaled, left to hang in grotesque silence. For hours, then days, then weeks, the killing continued. The earth darkened with blood. The air grew thick with rot. Birds gathered in black clouds, circling endlessly above, tearing at the dead and the dying alike. Wolves prowled the edges, drawn by the stench of easy prey. But it was not the animals that made this sight unbearable. It was the scale. When the final stake was driven into the ground, the field stretched endlessly, a forest of human bodies swaying in the wind. Some impaled through the chest, others through the back, some still twitching in half-life as the wood tore through. Their organs. Men, women, even children. None had been spared. The field became a monument of terror, a warning carved not in stone, but in flesh. And it was here, in this vastness of horror, that Vlad made his stand. In 1462, the Ottoman Empire marched on Wallachia, Its army vast and confident, they advanced with banners high, prepared to crush a ruler who had defied them one time too many. But as they approached the city of Târgoviște, what they saw broke even the will of hardened soldiers. Before them lay the forest. 20,000 bodies impaled on stakes, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun glared down on the pale skin of the dead. The smell carried for miles, choking soldiers before they could even reach the battlefield. The silence of the scene was worse than battle cries. An absence of life so profound it froze the blood of those who witnessed it. Chroniclers wrote that the Ottoman Sultan himself, upon seeing the field, could not bear the sight. His men recoiled, their courage shattered not by swords or arrows, but by the realization of what kind of enemy they faced. Here was not a ruler bound by human limits. Here was a man who ruled with death itself as his weapon. The forest stood for days, then weeks, until time and decay took the bodies back into the earth. But the memory never faded. Tales spread across Europe of a Wallachian prince who had turned men into trees, who had transformed his land into a graveyard, who had built an empire of fear so absolute that even the mightiest armies trembled before it. Vlad's cruelty had reached its peak. It was no longer punishment, no longer theatre, it was legend. And from that moment on, he would never again be remembered as merely a ruler. He would be remembered as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. A name carved into history with the blood of thousands. The fires of terror eventually burned themselves out. But the ashes they left behind would blacken Wallachia for generations. The fields where thousands once swayed on stakes grew silent again, grass pushing up through blood-soaked soil, trees reclaiming ground where forests of the dead had stood. Yet even as nature covered the scars, the people could not forget. Survivors carried the weight of trauma in their silence. Villages whispered only in shadows. Fathers taught sons never to question. Mothers instructed daughters to hide their differences, their faith, their heritage. It was safer to erase identity than to risk the suspicion of rulers who might use it as a weapon. For many, survival meant vanishing into conformity, burying the colors of their culture beneath the grey cloak of fear. Vlad himself did not escape the fate he had inflicted upon so many. Betrayal came, as it always does to rulers who wield terror as their only shield. Allies turned against him, foreign powers seized their chance, and his own people, exhausted by years of fear, no longer rose to defend him. He was imprisoned, humiliated, and eventually killed. Some say in battle, others whisper by the very nobles who had once bowed before him. His body was buried, but his shadow remained, a phantom that could not be confined to any grave. His story did not end with his death. It grew. Chroniclers and pamphleteers spread his legend across Europe. To some, he was a hero, a ruler who had stood against the Ottomans with a ferocity few dared match. To others, he was the devil incarnate, a monster who drank blood and feasted among corpses. The truth blurred into myth until it became impossible to separate man from legend. Vlad the Impaler became both ruler and phantom, history and nightmare, but beneath the legend lies a truth far darker than folklore. His reign had thrived on division, on turning difference into danger, on branding the other as unworthy of life. Foreigners, minorities, outsiders, and anyone who strayed from the rigid image of loyalty were not simply punished, they were erased. His cruelty was not just personal, it was systemic. It turned suspicion into policy, fear into law, and prejudice into death sentences. This legacy outlived him. Long after his forest of the impaled rotted into the earth, the idea he embodied, that power can be maintained by fear, that unity can be forged by destroying those deemed different, survived. Across centuries, rulers in many lands have drawn from the same poison well. They have painted enemies out of minorities, scapegoated the powerless, and convinced the fearful that cruelty is strength. And even now, the echoes remain. Look closely at the world today, and you will see the shadow of Vlad in every place where difference is punished. where fear is wielded as a weapon, where silence becomes the cost of survival. The stakes may no longer line the roadsides, but the message is the same. Obey, conform, erase what makes you different, or be destroyed. This is the true horror of Vlad the Impaler's reign. Not only the rivers of blood he spilled, not only the forests of corpses he left behind, but the enduring reminder of how easily humanity can be broken by fear, how quickly neighbors can turn against each other when suspicion is rewarded, how swiftly rulers can convince the desperate that cruelty is protection. And so, centuries later, his story forces us to ask, when fear is used to rule, when silence is mistaken for safety, and when cruelty is celebrated as strength, are we truly free? Or are we still living, in ways both visible and unseen, in a kingdom of shadows?